Hello everyone and welcome to this special webinar event on the reality of digitizing petrochemical supply chains. I'm Lindsay Coulson, Project Director at Petrochemical Update and the organiser of today's webinar. As some of you may already know, I'm one of the conference directors for the Petrochemical Supply Chain and Logistics Conference and Exhibition, which is being held on June the 11th and 12th at the George R. Brown Convention Centre in Houston. Produced by the Petrochemical Update, this webinar contextualizes digitalization as a key theme at the event. At a time when investment in digital solutions to optimize petrochemical supply chains is on the rise, why does there still appear to be a disconnect between the perceived and actual value of these next generation technologies? Exploring this issue today, I'm delighted to be joined by Khan Sood of Shell and Reggie Brown from Chevron, both of whom will be speaking on the Petrochemical Supply Chain and Logistics Conference track in June, which is taking place within our wider Downstream 2019 event. It is the largest ever event for the petrochemical industry, and it will be attracting 3,000 conference attendees and 7,000 exhibition attendees this June. So a special thank you for joining us on this webinar, and in celebration of the upcoming event, we're offering our listeners $200 off all tickets with the code webinar200, which you can enter in at the checkout on our website. So just to let you guys know, it does end on April 26th, next Friday. So I recommend that you log on and get your tickets as soon as you can. So as always, just to let you know as well, the petrochemical producer employees can attend the event for free. So simply sign up on our website and just click on the path that is most relevant to you. Now, just a brief bit of housekeeping before we kick off the discussion. This webinar will last for approximately 50 to 60 minutes, and it is being recorded. So we'll send out the full audio recording on Thursday this week. Please do ask any questions as and when they pop up. You can send them through the questions box on your screen. Our panelists will answer your questions at the end of the webinar, where we have allotted around 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So there will be 4 discussion topics in total today, and at the end of each discussion, we'll be putting a poll question to all of you in the audience. So do get involved and sign on sort of your answers, and we'll go into a little bit of detail on that with the panel. So without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our panel today. I'll be moderating, and Clifford Lee of Oxkin Value Chain has unfortunately been pulled away from the event. So just a quick thank you to Cliff for his contribution to the webinar content today. On the panel, we have Khan Sood lending his expertise. He works in business development for Shell's Connected Energy Group, and he supports a variety of power business development activities across the Americas in all aspects of power, whether it be renewable energy, thermal generation, load balancing, energy storage, and distribution, and has always been interested in blockchain, and especially seeing how the technology can fit into the future of energy. Our next speaker is Reggie Brown. He is currently the Global Category Manager of Logistics for Chevron Oronite, which is Chevron's petrochemical business unit. He's originally from Michigan and received his Bachelor of Science in Finance from Florida State University and his MBA in Finance from Southern Methodist University. He has 15 years of procurement and supply chain experience in 2 different industries. So it's safe to say that we are in safe hands today, and I'd just like to quickly sort of say thank you to everyone for signing up before we kick off the webinar, and I hope you find the content really engaging. So to start off the webinar, we'll be going to the fundamentals of supply chain optimization and looking at the desired business outcomes of the transition to supply chain 4.0. So the first question for my panel, what are the key outcomes that petrochemical companies are trying to achieve by digitalizing their supply chains? And Khan, can we start with you on this topic?
Sure. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I believe every company is kind of trying to see from being able to digitalize whatever process they're looking at. There's streamlined processes, cheaper outcomes, better access and use of data, and in general, by doing so, you hopefully get closer to the customer as well. I'm not sure if Reggie would agree with that, but those are the things that I generally see.
I agree. I think what I would add to that is we're looking to achieve actionable insights. So it's one thing to have data and have it presented in a way that's useful, but the key for us is that we are able to derive insights from that data, things that we can take action on to achieve those efficiencies, those cost reductions, and customer service.
Yeah, that makes sense because if you look at all the big tech companies currently, Amazon, Facebook, etc., I mean, all the petrochemical companies have vast amounts of data, but the problem is that it's all over the place, whereas those companies have their processes in place from the start on how to use the data.
Agree 100%.
What would you say are sort of the key enabling technologies to help kind of refine the sort of vast amounts of data that you have?
I don't think it's necessarily a technology thing. I think it's more of a business and just the people working on it. A lot of the problem is with the companies we have now, all the data is kind of in different silos and no one really knows what to do with it. You can have all the technology you want, but if no one's using the data correctly, it's not going to help.
I agree with that, Karn. I think one of the key things that we're seeing is that this is not just a technological shift, it's a cultural shift.
Right.
Much like the internet caused a huge cultural shift, this is also a huge cultural shift for non-tech companies to take advantage of new and emerging technologies with respect to data, which requires different skill sets and different thinking processes amongst the people. I think some of us are old enough to remember this shift in technologies that have occurred before, where the shift has to change from, say, for example, sending faxes to sending emails. If you've been sending faxes for your entire career and now email comes along, it requires a shift in your thinking to start thinking about sending things via email, just as an example.
For sure.
Okay, and I suppose in terms of, I guess, looking at IoT, for example, how do you implement that kind of system and, I guess, encourage your entire company, I suppose, to get on board and start adopting these kinds of sort of umbrella technologies? How does that look?
I think it's
Chevron,
go for it.
At Chevron, the push actually started with our chairman and CEO, Mike Wirth. He's made digital acceleration a priority for our company. And so when it comes from the top down, I think that initial push that has rippled into changes in the organization. We put together task force, we put together a data science team, and we put together central business intelligence team. So we start to have those changes pushed from the top, and then you create that ripple effect that's required throughout the organization.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely has to come from the top. Another thing that helps though is the fact that all these technologies now are getting some hype behind them, when like IoT, AI, distributed ledger technologies, all of these things have hype around them, so people hear about them and then they start asking too. But it definitely has to come from the top.
Okay, and I guess one more sort of very specific question in terms of, I guess, ERP systems. Is that something that's being implemented from the top at Chevron and Shell? Do you see that kind of making its way into your supply chains?
We've started working on that. There's some big changes happening in SAP that are upcoming. I can't really speak in detail because I don't think it's been released publicly. But yes, that's something that we've spent a lot of time working on and that we have initiatives focused on.
I'm in the same boat. I don't think I can talk about it unless it's public information. So a lot of it's still pretty internal.
No worries at all. Just to quickly let our audience know, we have made the first poll live, so do get your answers in currently. The first question is on, if you can pinpoint it, what specific benefit area are you focusing your digital spending on improving in 2019? So it's kind of just providing real overview. The options are end-to-end visibility, product forecasting, vendor relationship management, data gathering, and other. So I know Khan and Reggie both mentioned about sort of data gathering. That's a really key issue which the petrochemical companies are looking to work on. That is currently in the lead on our poll at 33% as the key focus point, closely followed by end-to-end visibility, which is 27% of the vote, and then shortly followed by vendor relationship management. What is your take on those options? Let's start with you, Reggie.
I think for us, many of these things are interrelated. From a supply chain standpoint, end-to-end visibility, I would agree, is a very high focus, but that's very closely tied with how we manage our relationships with our vendors, so we can track vendor performance, key metrics related to vendor performance. But having that end-to-end visibility, which we don't currently have, because there's many aspects where the data is siloed. In some cases, the data is not even in a digital form. That is very high priority for us to be able to move to the next step of deriving those actionable insights I spoke about.
Yeah, like Reggie said, a lot of digitizing everything is going to help with the interplay with all these things. For example, if you have all this different data in silos, but you manage to fix how you actually work with it, and then you have those, maybe put that data in the blockchain where you have that end-to-end visibility, and you can run some algorithms on that to get your product forecasting better, and then therefore have better relationships with your vendors. So I think it's a big part of it's going to be the interplay between everything.
Great. Okay, I think that just about wraps up our first topic. So moving on to the next topic, we're looking at roadblocks. And I know we kind of covered this a little bit already. So just to kind of reiterate, obviously we know that companies are investing heavily in supply chain digitization at the moment. But we also know, sort of based on recent surveys, that the vast majority of companies are not fully reaping the benefits of their investments to the extent that they fully envisioned. So I know we've kind of spoken about sort of legacy systems and legacy behaviours. I mean, why are these sort of issues such a challenge for petrochemical companies? And do you know of I guess any success stories where these challenges have been overcome? And it might be sort of more generally, not necessarily in the petrochemical supply chain space, but sort of in another industry perhaps that has dealt with similar problems. Khan, what is your sort of take on sort of the legacy system and legacy behaviour issue?
It's like Reggie was saying earlier, a lot of it is a cultural issue, right? These businesses are generally older, and you don't have as much of the Mark Zuckerberg move fast and break things mentality that is popular in Silicon Valley. There are already processes in place. You have to get all kinds of approvals to do anything simple. But the good thing is it seems to be changing a little bit. There is some part of it could also have to do with some of the talent gap, because between oil and gas and the petrochemical industry, there's a lot of boom and bust cycles that happen, but because more young people do seem to be moving into the industry and popularizing that mindset, and even a lot of the older people are still moving towards that, because now we see a lot of different teams looking at creating agile hubs, innovation centers. I know in Houston specifically, there's been a huge boom in investments in co-working infrastructure and startups around, and even most of the big companies are rolling out more innovative arms and having people looking at newer business models.
Yeah, the way I would describe it is in a single word: inertia. And I think the inertia comes in two forms. So there's the people and cultural inertia, which some of is actually justified because there's a caution associated with making a big change to something as integral to running your business as your ERP. But the second piece of the inertia is how we tie in with our suppliers. And we have to be very careful that we don't break linkages with our vendor relationships when we make these changes. So those things add up to be a very large cautionary approach to making these changes.
Yeah, agreed. I didn't even think about approaching it from that standpoint, but 100% correct. If you break those relationships, even everyone along the supply chain has that kind of relationship and the pretty similar cultures across the board. So it tends to all move together. So if someone starts shifting it, then and breaks things, then it kind of has a cascading effect too.
Yeah. What I would say in terms of success stories, what I've found to be a partial success story in some cases is what I like to call a glue solution. So there's the enterprise level solution where you're trying to fix your entire system, which is a huge monumental undertaking. But then there's glue solutions. So an example of what I mean by that is we've had some limited success in some small fit for purpose cases where we can use, for example, a piece of software like Spotfire or Microsoft Power BI, and we can actually pull data that might be siloed in different systems. It may even be trapped in Excel spreadsheets, but we can pull that data using a Microsoft Power BI or a Spotfire into one central place on a desktop or for a small team and create a dashboard that's able to tie that data together and use it. So we've had some successes there internally where you're not actually fixing the silo problem, you're not actually fixing the ERP system problem, but you're still able to pull that data together into something that's useful. You're able to glue that together.
Great. We've just been having the poll running for the second topic. So just to put the results to you, interestingly, data silos came up as the sort of biggest challenge that viewers are facing with regards to supply chain optimization, closely followed by legacy behaviours, and then also just the view that oftentimes sort of there's not really an awareness of what system is quite right for your business. So how are there any kind of takeaways from those results? Anything that surprises you guys at all? Khan, do you have any thoughts on these results?
Yeah, I mean, like we were saying, clearly data silos and the legacy culture is a big problem. The not knowing what system is right, I mean, obviously there's tons of different platforms, but at the end of the day, if you have the data correct, you can essentially put it into any system that works for it. It's really more of what tool do you need for the job, whereas if you have the initial data correct, you should be fine. I mean, I'm pretty sure Amazon and Facebook all have their own data silos, but they seem to be able to work with it and still manage to get to the end customer with exactly what they need.
Agreed. And I just go back to what I said previously about what I'm calling the glue solutions. a lot of people are using Excel spreadsheets to try to get around these data silos. And what I've found is that there have recently been some major enhancements to Excel, as well as these other applications like Microsoft Power BI, Tableau, and Spotfire. Those applications are able to pull data together, sometimes directly off the server, including Excel, or directly off the internet. And many people aren't aware of those capabilities. And they're actually pretty easy to use now. It's not like Excel from even 3 or 5 years ago. There's some enhanced capabilities in Excel and in these other tools that allow you to at least partially overcome some of these data silos. So I encourage people to look into those.
Yeah, and that's even just using the basic stuff that anyone can use, right? Excel is super easy to use. If you have enough data scientists to throw out the problem, you can have everyone just clean everything in Python or something, throw it in a Hadoop cluster, and then be done.
Yep.
Right. So just moving on to the third topic, I think that's all we have time for on that particular topic. We're looking at sort of big data. So in terms of big data, how can sort of, I suppose, where are the best places in the petrochemical supply chain that can take advantage of the information from big data? Are there any particular points in the supply chain that really benefit from sort of this kind of technology and overall data? Reggie?
So this isn't a direct answer to your question, but it's tangential. I think one of the emerging technologies that's really valuable and has the ability to generate big data is going to be real-time sensor data. So from a logistics standpoint, those things could include GPS tracking. It could include GPS tracking of actual shipments, or it could include GPS or RFID tracking of inventory. There's other sensor data, such as tracking fluid levels in a tank or in an ISO tank. Those technologies have the ability to create that big data that you can then apply some real-time analytics, because you don't have to go out and actually take those measurements or read the instrument visually. If you can take advantage of those sensors, that has the ability, in my mind, to revolutionize some of the ways that we manage efficiencies and costs across the supply chain.
Yeah, and in my opinion, kind of similar to what Reggie was saying, I think it's basically at the edges and in the aggregation of the data. So you have your real-time sensors, you're at the edges with your customers. All the big tech companies right now essentially can pinpoint exactly what their customers need or what they're doing and drive behavior because they have those edge cases. And the other thing is, once you have all that, you aggregate all that data, and then you can find patterns across a huge spectrum of things too. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's like right at the edges and in the aggregation.
Absolutely.
How can you use this kind of information in the supplier relationship management space?
It's kind of like what I was just saying, right? If you have all this data that you're using, you already somewhat know how your customers need to react and what you need to do, or you will at least be able to run some kind of predictive model and say, hey, this might be the way to do things.
Right, I agree. Elaborating on that, I would say it's good to think of it in terms of kind of two different focuses. One is past focus, and the other is future focus. So the past focus is descriptive, what have we done? Diagnostic, which is why have we done it, and what types of impacts are our behaviors having on our key metrics. And then the future looking is what can we predict? Are there any patterns that we can use based on that descriptive and diagnostic analysis? Are there any patterns we can use to predict what may occur in the future, where there's likely breakdowns or where there's more efficiencies to be generated or where there's bottlenecks that can be removed to anticipate what may be coming, and then to get action signals to actually act on that data to take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's great. Exactly. I couldn't have put it better myself.
I guess in terms of you talked about sort of forecasting and metrics. I don't know if you have any sort of really specific examples of exactly what sort of petrochemicals want to measure using forecasting and metrics, and how kind of identifying a specific example would help close out the gap between sort of financial gain and loss when kind of going on these digital journeys.
So I think everyone focuses on the financials, understandably why, but I think another key example would be, for example, in the logistics space, the transit time. So for example, from a descriptive analytics standpoint, you can understand how long is it taking me to get things from point A to point B. Diagnostic, I can understand, well, here's the bottleneck. It's taking us an inordinate amount of time to load a ship, for example, or to transfer from the manufacturing facility to the port, as a different example. Then from the predictive space, that's where you can start to understand, hopefully we eventually get to the place where you can say, you can tie that to, for example, weather forecasts or demand forecasts, and you can anticipate that this particular shipment at this time of year is going to take longer or shorter than it normally would, and that can actually impact your supply chain and or your relationships with your customers, just to give a specific example.
Agreed. I think, like you said, if we can cut down on the transit time and things, just like basically what Uber did as with their logistics, they have all this data in the back that they're using to essentially forecast and figure out where demand will be. If you can do that through a supply chain as well, you can get closer to the edge. If you also, same thing with like the cost focus. If you can tell where certain points of failure might be, then you can either reroute or, fix certain things that were happening along the way. So I think a big part of it will just be, yes, like you said, look back at the past, see where certain trends are, and then forecast in the future. And you can have all these different cases, and those are just a few of the even the basic ones that we think about.
Great. Just to wrap up sort of the third topic, sort of a much more general question that we ask the audience here. Is your spending on supply chain increasing or decreasing over the next 5 years? It kind of leads into our next topic a little bit. We had the results of 63% increasing, 8% decreasing, and 30% about the same. So, I mean, in some ways, unsurprising results. I don't know what your thoughts are, Khan and Reggie, on this result.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead, Reggie.
Now, I was just going to say, my initial reaction is, who are these guys that are decreasing? I'd like to meet them.
It does seem, even though it's quite low, it does seem sort of surprising, I suppose, in the sort of current supply chain 4.0 push that's really going on across all industries at the moment. But yeah, thank you very much to our audience for engaging with that question. It is time to move on to our fourth and final topic before we move into the Q&A, which kind of looks more to the future of petrochemical supply chains and where it's headed. So I suppose sort of Gartner, IBM, Forrester, all predicting we're kind of at the front end of a massive revolution sort of in digitization, and that will soon kind of be crossing a tipping point, I suppose, where all the companies who are not digitized will kind of be left in the dust. I mean, where do you see the petrochemical industry headed over the next 5 years, the petrochemical supply chain industry? Reggie?
So honestly, I agree with the prediction from a long-term standpoint, but I think our industry, as I mentioned before, is slow to change because of inertia. I think there's lots of problems that will have to be solved before, and many of them collectively, before we're able to take full advantage as an industry of these massive changes. That said, I do agree that there are massive changes coming. I think things like blockchain, things like the Internet of Things, as well as these other enterprise relationship management systems, the big data like Hadoop, like Karen mentioned earlier, those are very massive changes, and the implications of those I don't think are fully understood yet. I don't think it's fully understood exactly how we can capitalize on these things as an industry. So my opinion is that we'll see some significant changes over the next 5 years, but our industry in particular, I believe, will take a bit longer to adopt those changes.
I agree, and I think what we were talking about earlier about how the people that don't keep up will probably not make it through, but at the same time, whenever I talk to people at other companies or anything, everyone's basically looking at the same kind of things. No one necessarily knows exactly the right formula yet or what the interplay will actually be. But if you're not looking at them, then you are going to get left behind at the very least. If nothing else, someone might come up with a solution, and if you haven't been involved in some way, then you're just going to get left behind.
Yeah, and to add on what you said earlier, Karen, I do think some of it is a generational challenge, being that the younger generations who grew up with advanced, what we consider advanced technology. I got a 3-year-old nephew who knows iPads and laptops, whereas some of us are still learning the full implications of those things. I think it's harder for our leadership to envision what that new future would look like versus some people in the younger generation that have grown up with these technologies.
I guess sort of moving on, I know we sort of discussed together before the call regarding digital twins. So does a petrochemical company really need a digital twin? And I guess, first of all, can you start off by quickly defining what a digital twin would look like for a petrochemical company? And Khan, are you sort of, you're involved a little bit in that area?
Yeah, so I mean, digital twins are essentially just digital representations of a physical process or object. They're essentially just models. Just they end up being different kinds of models than you might run as like a finance model, but inputs and outputs are generally pretty similar. I think, I mean, you could do all kinds of things. You could basically have a whole digital twin of your supply route. You could have anything from the manufacturing process. You'd have basically the whole manufacturing process listed out as a digital twin, and then that would be able to show you, it would run the model on it and then show you where certain points of failures would be during the manufacturing process or during the supply chain process, as Reggie was saying earlier, with like if you can predict weather forecasts of certain areas, then you would be able to model that out. At this point, I think everyone should be using the data and technology that we have at our hands. If we can build out better models than we were able to in the past, why don't we? Obviously, a model is only as good as the people that are running it, but by tweaking them and continually updating them as a whole industry, it'll probably get a lot better as we continue on.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the concept is very important. I think it's also important to recognize that those models can be used for a variety of things. So you can use it for a shipment forecast or tracking. You can use it for a warehouse management or inventory management. You can even use it for finances, where it might not be considered strictly by the definition of digital twin, but it can be a highly useful model that's very important.
Agreed.
Great. And I guess sort of much more of a general question, I suppose, kind of rounding off some of the discussion. What is sort of the best investment case, I guess, for modernising a petrochemical supply chain design? So a very general question. What is the best investment case, Reggie?
The way I think about making the investment case is obviously the first thing that comes to mind is the quantitative and cost element. You want to be able to present the case for what's the return on investment. What is the cost going to be for this change that you're proposing, and what are the returns? There's also the qualitative aspect of evaluation. So, for example, what kind of impact could you have on safety? So sometimes you can quantify that, sometimes you can't quantify that, but those increase and enhance safety for your personnel can be a critical component of making a business case on why we should invest in a certain technology or why we should make certain changes. And then there's also the things, I keep going back to time as a key cost or resource, if you will, that's not money. Sometimes a time savings doesn't necessarily generate a cost savings, but the time saving has value in and of itself. So an efficiency that generates cost savings, those are things that tilt the scale on the reward side of the return on investment that can help you make that business case.
I agree. I think we're going to see, or at least at this point, I think there'll probably be more qualitative benefits that you'd have to push out because, yes, you can put hard numbers, and obviously that's the easiest way to do it. But for a lot of the things we're looking at, the numbers might not quite be there if all you're looking at is purely current cost savings and installs. A lot of it's looking to the future and seeing, hey, if we start here, where could we end up? And hopefully you can make a case for that. But it's also very hard to do that.
Got you. I guess sort of rounding off the discussion, I guess, before we move on to the poll and the Q&A, do you see the petrochemical industry starting to transform supply chain design to account for digital disruption?
I think pretty much everyone is going to start transforming the way they do things. I think there's going to be a huge reimagining of across industries of how we do things as these technologies come into play. We haven't even really scratched the surface of what they can do. I mean, there's a lot of hype around blockchain technologies and companies still, even after all the hype died down a little bit. You can start to see it's still making its way through, but no one really knows what it's going to do yet. Or it's like looking at the internet back in the Web 1.0 era, right? You don't know, you had no idea what we would see.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think what we're starting to see is some marginal changes, so not necessarily a full transformation, but some marginal changes and some spot changes around the edges. So for example, one example is the use of drones. So one area where I think we find some low-hanging fruit is using drones for safety inspections of stacks. So those types of things would normally require a plant shutdown, a person climbing up the stack to inspect it. That type of thing increases safety risk. But by using drones, it becomes far more cost effective, it becomes faster, and it becomes safer. So that's an example of using technology to try to capture some of that low-hanging fruit and start to make those changes. Other examples are on the logistics side, tracking of shipments. Again, there's inertia in the industries where folks are reluctant to invest in the technology required to track shipments real time, but it is happening to some extent. And you get those qualitative benefits such as being able to anticipate the arrival, such as being able to communicate better with customers. So we're starting to see that, but we aren't seeing full transformations yet. We're seeing incremental changes.
Great, and I'm kind of just supporting sort of the examples that you just gave, Reggie. There is sort of a lot of interest, I guess, on our poll in sort of drones, autonomous vehicles, robotics. Khan, I know you mentioned about blockchain as well at the outset. That is something that's very much a buzzword, but just kind of from conversations that I've had, it's obviously a lot of companies are really looking to invest in blockchain, but it's something that's not, I suppose, fully a part of petrochemical company supply chains, or indeed sort of fully embedded in other industries. Quite a strong result for blockchain there with 56%. I don't know, Khan, if you could kind of talk a little bit more about sort of where you think blockchain will fit into the petrochemical supply chain industry kind of over the next 5 years or so, or maybe it's even sort of a decade or even longer. What are your thoughts on kind of that level of integration of blockchain?
Yeah, this poll result pleases me because that's basically my area of expertise. So I've apparently come up with a pretty good career hedge for the next few years. Yeah, so I think supply chain is basically one of the lowest hanging fruit from blockchain. If you can get all the data together and you can have the sensors along the way talking to each other, it makes perfect sense to use blockchain for basically all kinds of things in supply chain, including like financial pieces, back office kind of settlements and things whenever that needs to happen. Those are the two biggest, basically, financial and then just managing the supply chain in general. It seems to be like the thing I would say would be the easiest to do.
Yeah, I agree. Blockchain has a huge, tremendous upside. It's one of those things that I question how quickly we can adopt it because it requires mass adoption at the same time to really reap the benefits. One of the areas that I think may be underrepresented by this poll is autonomous vehicles. And I have a split opinion on that. So when we think about open road autonomous vehicles, I think that's a long way off from widespread adoption. And my opinion is it's not because of the technology so much as it is the liability. Who's responsible, and how do you determine responsibility in case of an incident? However, that said, I believe that in a closed environment, such as a warehouse or such as a plant, I think the opportunity for efficiencies and speed and accuracy enhancements and tying into some of these other technologies such as RFID tracking, inventory tracking, movement, loading, all of those things, I think autonomous vehicles have a step change breakthrough in efficiency potential in a closed environment.
Yeah, I think one thing that isn't mentioned is I think not necessarily virtual reality, but I think augmented reality could be a big piece too. Just moving forward, seeing, especially with what we were talking about with the digital twins being able to predict things, or you just having forecasted metrics. You could send someone out to a certain point of failure and have them looking at some scope diagram while they're working on something. Just little pieces like that, I think would end up being. There's all kinds of ideas that you could have with that. I think that's a big piece that we haven't really talked about much.
I agree 100%. That one isn't discussed a whole lot. I haven't seen it discussed a whole lot outside of gaming applications. But augmented reality, I think a lot of folks don't necessarily understand the difference between augmented reality and virtual reality. And so that probably needs more marketing for folks to understand what the benefits could be.
Great. I think that's all we have time for on that topic. That was a really, really interesting discussion there. We're going to sort of move on to the final segment of this webinar, which is the Q&A. So throughout this webinar, we've had some questions submitted from our audience. So just to kind of start off with, the first question I have goes back to the second topic, which was on sort of legacy systems and legacy behaviours within petrochemical organisations. And the question is, can you share sort of legacy behaviour examples, maybe within your own experience or sort of just within from talking to other sort of industry insiders? What examples do you have, and I guess how can you get around them? Khan.
Sure. I mean, it's like I was saying before, right? A lot of it is just the mentality. Like Reggie said, the culture. It's just that with Silicon Valley, you generally have the move fast and break things culture. You don't have that here. You have to go through all kinds of approvals. One thing that we were looking at is in the few of the our Salesforce instances. Well, actually, I heard this from someone else. They had something that there was a limit on their version that only had 40 approvals that it could be done. And he basically was like, what, if you need more than 40 approvals for this single thing, it's probably not a great business model that you have going on.
Yeah, I agree. I think that our industry motto could be more move slow and don't break anything.
Great. And I guess our sort of next question from our audience, do you find your company, so this would be Shell and Chevron, do you find your company ahead or behind your ecosystem in terms of digitizing? Sort of quite an insightful question there. Reggie, can we start with you on this one?
I didn't fully hear the question. Ahead or behind in terms of what?
So do you find your company ahead or behind your ecosystem in terms of digitizing?
I think we're slightly ahead, at least in the logistics space. I think we're slightly ahead. We're trying to push our logistics vendors to be more forward thinking. I do think I'm finding that large parts of the traditional logistics industry, freight movement, is slow to change. There's some change, but they're slow to change, and they aren't particularly forward-looking. So we're pushing them to be more forward-looking. We're pushing them to do many of the things that we've discussed earlier on this call in terms of analytics, in terms of tracking, in terms of investment in technologies that will help provide more benefits. But I find that in the logistics space, the mentality seems to be that their job is to move things from point A to B, and that's it. And so we're pushing them to expand that thought process to be able to provide more value-added services and a higher level of customer service in the form of technology.
Yeah, it's I'm not sure whether I'd put us ahead or behind. I think we are doing a lot of stuff in the digitalization space and just in general with all the new business units that we've been rolling out. But I also think that when I talk to other companies, and everyone's essentially working on the same kind of thing, so I think it's going to be more of a rising tide deal where one person will hopefully start lifting everyone else, and then everyone will rise together.
Great. And another question from our audience, and this actually kind of refers back to Reggie. You were talking a little bit earlier about sort of drones and investment in drones. How do you measure or sort of plan for sort of your return on investment, ROI, of new technology when the benefits may actually be qualitative rather than quantitative. So sort of the example that was given here is in drones for safety inspections, for example.
So I don't think culturally we fully answered that question. And Karin alluded to this earlier, that in the early stages of technology adoption, the benefits are largely qualitative more so than quantitative, sometimes because you can't calculate what that quantity would be. So I think the answer there, for us, safety is a very high priority, and I think it is for most oil and gas companies, but that goes all the way up to the top. So as a qualitative concern, if we can simply show that this removes people from the line of fire, as one example, that puts a thumb on the scale. It may not tip it all the way, but it does put a heavy, firm thumb on the scale. But I don't think there's a clear cut answer. And I think that part of our change and our shift culturally is going to be, how do you make these decisions when the solutions may not be fully quantifiable?
Yeah, totally agree. Don't have much more to add to that, but as you said, safety is a huge issue. It could also eventually just be you saying, hey, look, we have these drones, it cuts down this many man hours too. So it is technically a cost reduction in the manpower, but then hopefully you free up that time for people to do other jobs. But once again, it's hard to quantify at this stage exactly what you could have happen, but the safety piece is huge.
Brilliant. And our final question that we have time for today, we have a member of our audience asking, has anyone explored using Microsoft Access for data gathering and analysis? They said that they've been able to use this to break the data silos and everyone is having access to data for decision making. What are your thoughts on this, on Microsoft Access? Let's start with you, Khan, if that's okay.
Sorry, you kind of cut out there. Was the question basically just to see if we could use Microsoft Access for data gathering? I missed part of it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So, yeah, they've just said they've been able to break data silos using Microsoft Access. Do you think that's a viable solution?
Sure. Like I said earlier, it's all about really getting the data correct. You can use almost any tool you want as long as you have the capability. A lot of times I've seen people use Access. You have plenty of Access databases. You can throw it in other kinds of databases, use Python or R to clean it up, and then put it right back into a different database that other people could use easier.
I've explored using Microsoft Access quite extensively, and what I found is that there's a learning curve to using Microsoft Access that most people aren't willing to go through to use it effectively. Most people will use the Swiss Army knife, which is Excel, and there is a lower learning curve, and with the enhancements that I mentioned earlier that have occurred with Excel in the form of, say, Power Query, Power Pivot, as well as other Microsoft tools like Microsoft Power BI, I think that those tools are more accessible than Access for the general use. The other piece that I found with Access is I can set up an Access database, but when I go to share that data with someone else or to transition my role to someone else, they go blank when they look at the learning curve associated with Microsoft Access, whereas I don't get that same response if I'm transitioning it using Excel. So if your organization can support it culturally, it's a very powerful tool. I personally went the different direction because I found that people weren't able or possibly willing to manage the learning curve associated with Access rather than Excel.
Yeah, or just having people run generic SQL databases anyway. That Access is one way to do it, but if you already know SQL, then you can just pull it anyway. So it's more of a question of, like you said, Reggie, it's like, what are people willing to use?
Great. Fab, I think that is all we've got time for in terms of our discussion and our Q&A today. So thank you to our amazing panelists, Reggie and Khan, for both of your thoughts and insights. I thought it was some really great discussion and food for thought. For sort of the audience that are still with us, I really hope you enjoyed listening in as much as I did. And to reiterate what was said at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending you the full recording of this webinar this coming week. So look out for that in your email inbox. Just a quick sort of final reminder that the webinar was brought to you in conjunction with the Petrochemical Supply Chain and Logistics Conference and Exhibition, which is being held on June 11th and 12th at the George R. Brown Convention Centre in Houston, where Khan and Reggie will be presenting on our end-to-end visibility panel and the digital supply chain panel discussion, respectively. So definitely worth getting your tickets now. If you like what you heard, visit our website, which is www.petchem-update.com/petrochemical-supply chain, and you can use the special discount code, which is webinar200, to save $200 off your ticket. And we hope to see you all there in June. Thank you so much for listening. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.